In relation to passing tax exams, whether it's the TX exam or indeed any other exam, I think it's important to understand the context in which you operate. What I mean by that is this, is you have to understand the nature of tax exams, because they're slightly different, I think, to other exams. Not necessarily harder or easier, but they're just slightly different. There's a number of points in the next sort of 30 minutes or so in relation to this course outline or course introduction, if you will, that I want to relay to you that are so important before you start going through the content. The sorts of things that I want you to be thinking about, and certainly I've learned these things in relation to tax exams that I have done, and I've done a lot of those, I can tell you. And also from my experience of dealing with students, both prize-winning students, students in the middle, and students that have the misfortune of failing this particular paper, resitters. I think the key first point is that obviously when you approach the ACCA TX exam, because of where it is within the ACCA qualification, it may well be that you have no experience of tax. It may well be that you know several people that have failed it. It may well be that you have that sort of perhaps slightly negative view of tax that many people have. You'll be familiar with the phrase of the American president that only two certainties in life: death and taxes. Now, for me, in terms of your approach to this course, I think that it's so important that you come at this revision course with a sort of blank page and listen to the advice that I give you. I mean, I've had very, very good success with teaching students in this exam, I can assure you, and other tax exams. But, this video isn't about me, this course isn't about me, it's about your success. And your success for me is based on how you approach this content and the sorts of thoughts that are going on in your head in relation to the various tax heads that are within TX, and indeed the various questions and challenges that you face. But let's think about the ACCA TX paper and how it's split into three parts and what the emphasis is. In other words, what is the examiner trying to do? Is he trying to turn ACCA students into tax experts? Do you need to be a tax expert, or do you need to work in tax to be able to pass this paper? Not at all. All you need to do is to have a right approach to the underlying content, whether or not it's capital gains tax, income tax, etc., and employ some good exam technique. And you'll hear me talk quite a lot in this course about exam technique, because for me, the key area in this particular exam, the TX exam under the ACCA banner, in terms of passing, is your technique. It's not your knowledge. And from the students that I've taught over the years, particularly research students, I think students tend to fixate on the difficulty level within TX, and they tend to assume or presume that they need to be some sort of expert in all of the 5 tax heads to be able to pass. No, they don't. They need to have good, solid exam technique and reasonable content knowledge. If we think about the various tax heads, and I'll come on to the underlying content of the course in a moment, we have income tax, corporation tax, VAT, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax. So we have 5 main tax heads. What is tax about? What's the examiner's job in these 3 sections of the paper? What is he trying to do? Well, in essence, for me, tax is about rules. It's about tricky little rules. So spread across the paper, there are a series of these rules. And if we know enough of them, then we can get through towards that 50% mark. So how do we do that? Well, relating it back to the contents of this course, we'll see in the main section, in other words, the revision videos pertaining to the 5 tax heads. That's the biggest part of this course. You'll see me walk through a number of different questions, starting off with income tax and basic computations, going through to corporation tax, capital gains tax, etc., etc. So the core of this course is really the various parts of the subject content videos, and there's a number of hours there. Now, your approach to watching those videos and to learning those content and revising those content should really be bite-sized. What I would be doing if I was you is taking one section at a time and probably one question at a time. You'll certainly see that because of the number of questions in that element of the course, it's going to take you a fairly long time to get through it, but I'd encourage you to do it in bite-sized chunks, because there's a lot of information, particularly in the very, very long questions. To absorb all of that over the course of 2-3 hours, if that's how long you're studying for, I think is very, very difficult. So let's learn how to fight our battles. Let's fight it in small parts. Now, what the examiner is doing within these questions, let's just take a typical income tax computation, perhaps where the individual has multiple forms of income, and it's a 15 marker in part 3 of the actual exam itself. What the examiner is doing in the scenario is laying you out a various set of sorts of tricks and traps based on this particular individual, and asking you whether or not you can populate an income tax computation. Okay? Now, our approach to that style of question, I'm talking specifically about the longer form questions, in this case an income tax question. Our approach has to be to give the examiner what they want. So, if the requirement says prepare an income tax computation and show the income tax payable for Mr. X, then let's make sure within the time allowed, based on 15 marks, that that's what the examiner gets. Now, you may be sitting wherever you are in the world thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. Well, in my experience, it's not. Let me explain what I mean. In an income tax computation, long form, or in perhaps a corporation tax computation, long form, the examiner's job is to stop you getting to the end of the question. In other words, in relation to the income tax comp, the examiner's job is to stop you, in my opinion, producing an income tax computation and showing the income tax payable. How's he going to do that? Well, what the examiner is going to do is to put in various parts of the question scenario tricky little areas. You know, little tricks, little rules that are a little bit complex that you'll need to dwell on for a while. Now, the problem with this is, and here's the key, a lot of students approach taxation, whether or not it's an income tax computation, as I've described, or any form of computation, as if they need to get it 100% right. And this comes on to my first sort of important concept in terms of your success, because that's what we're interested in here. I've got it past your success in this exam, and it's something that I refer to as the perfection trap. Now, what I mean by that is that very often students that underperform in tax exams have this idea that as they go from long form question to long form question, they need to be perfect. In other words, they need to get everything right. And what tends to happen, because the TX examiner is a very smart examiner, is that they tend to dwell on different areas of the question and get stuck and spend too much time. Therefore, they don't end up getting to the end and producing an income tax computation. Or if they do, they overrun seriously on time, which means, let's say that the corporation tax question, another 15 marker, they have to cut it short at the end. So in essence, what I'm saying is concept number one for your success in this paper is to recognize, particularly in part 3, longer form questions. The parts 1 and 2, A and B, are slightly different. I'm focusing in on the latter part of the exam. It's so important that you read the requirements carefully and that you produce what the examiner has asked you to produce: an income tax computation showing income tax payable, a corporation tax computation showing corporation tax payable, a VAT return calculation showing VAT due at the end of the period. What we mustn't do is get sucked in, as the examiner wants you to do, in relation to certain areas. Even when I've done tax exams, and I've done a lot of tax exams, and I guess I'm a tax expert, I get caught out by different rules. Everyone will. There's so much to know in tax. There's so much to learn. But my point is this: the pass mark in the ACCA TX paper is 50%. It's not 100%. So therefore, there's a massive margin of error allowed. We can get 50% of the paper wrong and still pass. Now, this is as much a piece of examination technique advice as common sense, really. We've got to make sure that as we process down questions, long form questions in particular, that we understand that we have to make decisions and move on. Very often, we can take a guess. A simple example might be in a corporation tax computation for, let's say, a company where a series of expenses that have been deducted from accounting profit need to be adjusted. I'm talking about the adjustments to trading profits. Now, there's so many different little rules there, it's difficult to remember them all. But let's think about it. If we're in a position where we're doing a corporation tax computation that includes trading income, therefore we have to do some add backs, or quite a few add backs. If we simply guess on one or two of them, we have a 50% chance of getting it right, rather than spend 4, 5, 6 minutes scratching our heads and thinking, is it allowable? Is it disallowable? I hope you see my point. The key area, and for me, one key area of success in this exam is making sure that we don't underperform in the long form questions. And I'd encourage you to carefully watch the examination technique videos in relation to long form that you'll see within the course breakdown, and indeed the objective test or multiple choice examination technique breakdown. Because exam technique for the different parts, particularly section A, B versus section C, is slightly different. Exam technique for a long form question, is broadly as I've just described. Let's give the examiner what they've asked for in the time allowed. Now, OT style is slightly different because it's right or wrong. But my key point in relation to tax overall is to avoid the perfection trap and being absolutely perfect. We don't need to be, because of that massive margin of error. So more of these points certainly within our 2 videos on examination technique, both for section A and B, and indeed for long form section C. So moving on to my next point. Now, this refers to the 5 tax heads. We know that the emphasis within the ACCA TX exam UK is on income tax and corporation tax. We know probably following that is capital gains tax, with inheritance tax and VAT really low priority. Okay, we need to know them, but the focus is on making sure prior to getting into the exam that we're very, very savvy with income tax and corporation tax. If we're not, passing this exam is going to be tricky. Now, I'll refer you back to what I said a few moments ago in relation to the main part of the course. You'll see that listed as income tax part 1, part 2, corporation tax part 1, part part 2. So 4 sections on the 2 taxes, the 2 most important ones, and then several other sections in relation to obviously capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and VAT. Our focus is going from the start to the end. We must get on point in relation to income tax producing IT comps, in relation to corporation tax producing corporation tax comps. That is our absolute priority. If you're feeling yourself at the outset of this course weak on those areas, then those are the areas to plug first. And just on that point, in terms of where you are in your studies, I don't know if you've been on a taught course, or perhaps if you're self-studying and you're just availing of a revision course from Got It Pass. You know, there's lots and lots of time over even a couple of weeks if that time is spent well. What I mean by that is that the do's and don'ts of study, are adhered to. Now, in terms of study and in terms of how best make use of your time, and indeed this course over, let's say, 10 to 14 days or thereabouts, there are some do's and don'ts in relation to tax exams that will be my second main point. And these are areas that I've fallen foul of myself, but also areas that I see particularly with resit students, okay? Now, the key concept really is this. We need to, as ACCA TX students, we need to fail to succeed. Let me say that again, in case you're thinking this man's gone crazy. We need to fail to succeed. In other words, we can watch the videos produced by Got It Pass and indeed myself. We can watch the tutor, the lecturer, walking through questions. This is very, very important. But at the end of the day, you have to put yourself into a position as regularly as you can where you're messing questions up, where you're failing questions, where you're learning from failure. Absolutely. Watching videos is one thing, Reading notes or making notes, the value of that at this stage, several weeks out from a tricky enough exam, is very, very low. So in terms of study, doing is where it's at. In other words, jumping in at the deep end and, if necessary, totally messing up the question and learning from that failure. Learning by going through the model solution with a fine-tooth comb. Let's say a typical example. Let's say that a question takes you, for argument's sake, 30 minutes to do. Let's just say it's a long-form question. In terms of your approach to reviewing the solution, you should be taking a minimum of 15 minutes, however you did, to go through that solution in detail with a highlighter or with a pen, and making sure that before you move on, you're savvy with all the areas that you messed up, okay? It's absolutely crucial. It's called trial and error. And what you'll find across the board in examinations generally, but certainly within tax, it's absolutely key, is this process of dropping yourself in it with questions, with question packs, is essential to success. What I see a lot of resit students doing within the TX exam is avoiding what I've just said. Watching videos, making notes, reading a textbook, but no questions. I do a lot of coaching in tax in particular, and when I ask, let's say, multiple resit students, so students that have sit a tax exam, particularly ATX, several times, one of the first questions I ask them is, how many mock exams did you do under full exam conditions, and how many practice questions did you do under full exam conditions, to time, closed environment, phone off, no social media, 100% focus. And when I ask that question, particularly to multiple resit students, very often, guess what the answer is? If I say to them, oh, let's say you did 100 hours of study, what percentage of those hours do multiple resit students in ATX tell me that they spent doing exam questions under exam conditions? I can tell you, it's not good news, between 0% and 20%. In other words, some students, in effect, arrive on the big day in ATX and certainly in TX without having done questions under the exact same conditions as they'll face on the big day. And then they wonder about why they underperform on exam day and fail the exam. Well, it's obvious, because we haven't replicated the conditions that we're going to face on the big day, the pressure, the stress, the complexity, etc., etc. If we don't replicate that often enough, we don't learn, and therefore our chances of performing on the big day, I'm not saying you'll absolutely fail, I'm saying they go down rapidly. You know, the bottom line, everybody, is no pain, no gain. We can't avoid doing questions. We can't avoid doing mock exams. We can't if you want success. And just on a personal note, not that it's any of my business what you do with your time, but certainly in terms of my career, not just with lecturing, but prior to that as a tax advisor to SMEs and many, many different businesses in London and elsewhere. Certainly in terms of success, what I see from success with successful people is successful people recognize that no pain, no gain. So all I'm saying to you is don't listen to me necessarily, but have a think about the logic in what I've just said. If we're not prepared to face some pain and maybe some disappointment of getting things wrong or failing a mock in the build-up towards the big day, then we're really on a sticky wicket. We're really in a bit of trouble. We've got to put ourselves in a position regularly that we're going to be on the big day. Okay, so that's my second key point. Just getting back to the whole idea of the 5 tax heads. Now, if we were to focus in on real core information, and I think this is mostly relevant to income tax and corporation tax, you know, one thing that we've got to get to grips with very, very quickly, notwithstanding what I've said previously, is the ability to lay out computations that are reasonably accurate quickly. An income tax comp, a corporation tax comp, a calculation of capital gains tax based on 3 or 4 disposals, you know, a VAT return calculation. You know, these sorts of things are absolutely core. If we're struggling to lay out the basics, then we're going to have a problem on the big day. So let's remember, as we go from tax head to tax head, you've got to make sure that you can do the basics well. All the tricky bits, the difficult bits, the high-end marks, let's leave that to the prize winners. Let's do the basics well. And that is computations across the 5 tax heads. And for me, on the basis that you've done some work prior to this revision course, you know, getting up to speed and getting reasonably quick to lay out a reasonable computation. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but it's not difficult. So keep that at the forefront of your mind, is that the ACCA TX examiner doesn't want a series of prize winners. He wants students that can deal with each of the tax heads and produce basic computations. Now, moving on to 1 or 2 other points, and I'll close up in a moment. Thank you for listening so far. You know, in terms of your approach within questions, there's several things that I think that you should be doing. Maybe you've heard of them before, maybe not, but I'm going to tell you anyway, and you'll hear me refer to these things during the course. Within tax, we've talked about the complexity of tax legislation and the rules, and there's quite a lot of it, of course. We're going to study that. We've talked also briefly about examination technique, answering the questions, sticking to time. Another key area within tax is more important than people think, I think, is in the longer form questions is presentation. In other words, being able to present information well, and indeed so that you can use it. From my experience in terms of teaching ACCA TX, where I come across a mock exam script that is very disorganized, it's all over the place. There's no columns, just random information here, there, and everywhere. 9 times out of 10, that student fails. There's a relationship, there's a correlation between reasonably solid presentation and the result. They tend to go together. I'm not suggesting that if you have a disorganized script that's accurate, you're going to fail, not at all. But generally speaking, with most people, with most students, where they're organized in their work, where they present well, let's say with an income tax computation, they have the columns in, they recognize that there's several parts to the comp. Firstly, populate the top end, populate with income. Then we've got the personal allowance, maybe there's an adjustment. We've got taxable income, and then we've got the application of the rates, and then finally possibly taking off credits. 4 main parts there. But if they've done that often enough, you can tell by the comp. On the flip side, if they haven't done it often enough, you can tell by the comp, because the comp is all over the place. Things are not where they should be, the columns are back to front, the parts are back to front, etc., etc. So, you're immediately giving yourself up to the marker. If your marker doesn't see reasonably well presented computations within your paper, more often than not, the marker will think, okay, the chances of all of these numbers being correct, or 50% of them being correct, probably low. That's my experience. I'm only telling you what I've seen. Don't kill the messenger. Presentation is important for that reason, but it's also important for another reason. And I want to bring you on to the subject of marking tax exams and your marker. Now, the course as it stands is very, very comprehensive. We know that in particular the run through of the questions should be absolutely invaluable to you. But let's recognize at the end of the day, the person that has your life in their hands is your marker. Make your script marker friendly. Do what you're asked to do, and do it in order. As mentioned, present well. Remember that ACCA TX markers have a very, very tough job. So make the marker's life easy. Use spacing. Use your columns. There's no penalty for using space. It's not like we're looking at emissions or kill the planet, kill the trees. There's no penalty for spacing out your answer. There's no penalty for making it clear, oh, here's the notes, 1, 2, 3, or here's the workings, 1, 2, 3. Get on side with your marker. Now, why do I emphasize this particular point? Because in my experience with speaking with lecturers and tutors, and indeed ACCA markers, they're human. Being on side with them may get a result for you. In other words, it may well be that if there's a little bit of doubt, they may tick instead of putting a cross. In other words, if they can see clearly that the student's making an effort to make their lives easier, they're more enamored towards you. So I guess that sort of final point encompasses the whole thing, is really that passing tax exams is a bit like cooking a good meal. Passing the ACCA TX exam is like cooking a good meal. All we need to do is to put in the main ingredients and a reasonable amount of them, and then that meal, that ACCA TX meal, which means you pass, is going to come out. If we're leaving significant elements of the ingredients out, for example, very poor exam technique, very poor time management, a student has favored 3 or 4 of the tax heads but doesn't like corporation tax, so didn't study it. If we're doing any of these sorts of things, our chances of passing this exam go down, down, down. One of the things that I used to find in my own studies, not just in tax, but in other areas, that I learned was not the right approach is, where you hit something perhaps during the course that's tricky, it's difficult, it's complex, you don't quite understand it, you try to understand it perhaps in the taught phase of your ACCA TX course, you've tried to get an understanding of it by listening to me, but you still don't get it, just leave it. Don't hang on to something and say, I'm going to sit here for the next 3 or 4 hours until I get this. Don't do that. Walk away, give yourself a break. Remember that your sort of physical, mental, spiritual well-being is as important as the hours that you do in terms of preparing for this ACCA TX exam. So make sure you get a bit of balance right in these last few weeks leading to the exam. What we don't want is you to be banging through 22 hours of the course, and to be absolutely whacked out and wrecked on the day of the exam, because you'll underperform in the exam. I'm not saying you'll fail it, but you'll underperform if you're tired, if you're whacked out, if you haven't slept well, okay? So do remember that a balance is required between good study and other things like sleep, absolutely, exercise, good food, etc., etc. A balance is required. You're not a machine, you're a human being. So I hope you'll take that advice on board, even though it's obviously not my business what you're eating on a regular basis, but we want you to pass this exam and we want you to do it now, okay, on this sitting. Okay, so that really summarizes the course. It's pretty simple, really. It's a combination of exam technique videos and indeed content videos. So bottom line is, let's get stuck in and let's move towards success. What I would say, again, as I sort of alluded to at the off, you've got to believe in your ability to pass this exam. So believe it now. It doesn't cost anything. It's not illegal to believe that you can pass TX. Hundreds, thousands of students have come before you and passed TX, and I've taught many thousands of students for this exam, and I can tell you that many of the students who are now fully qualified, mostly, many of the students, they're not tax experts. They're not tax, not at all. They just have a modicum of good knowledge and good technique. So this could be you come results day. We just need to put one foot in front of the other. Remember, the pass mark is 50%, not 100, and keep a positive attitude and work hard. Remember, no pain, no gain.